Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to see so many people here today. I know this is a very big topic, democracy or democratization in China. This has been a topic that has been discussed for many years, or at least for over a century. If you use the May 4th movement back in 1919 as the starting point, this year, 2019, is exactly 100 years. So it's, democracy in China was treated as one of the two millennial goals, or at least the centennial goals. But so far, after 100 years, we still don't see this realization yet in China. Of course, in the last few years, especially after Trump became the president of the United States, then it has become a very popular conclusion that 40 years ago, the West and others thought if China would develop economically, then democracy and the rule of law would come automatically. So now everyone says, well, we have not seen that happening. So was it a mistake to help China to develop economically first, and then expecting democracy to come next? But I have to say that, oh, by the way, I'm Chen Zhiwu. I'm the director of the Asia Global Institute. I forgot to mention who I am. But I have to say that whether China should democratize, I think to a large extent, as a practical question, the answer should definitely be a big yes. So I can at least mention three quick reasons. The first reason is there used to be no modern transportation or even somewhat modern transportation network in China. So I'm from Hunan, so I always use Hunan as an example. So in my hometown, there used to be no road, whether it's railroad or horse road, or ocean or sea, water road, let alone no air road going to my county, Taling in Hunan. So whatever treasure or valuable things Hunan had, no one, whether the Chinese emperor or minister of finance or the governor in Hunan, would be able to move anything really of value out of my county, because the physical reality was that unless you have mass transportation means, you would not be able to move anything of any scale out of my county, right? So in that sense, democracy was not really needed, because what could the emperor really do, who was based in Beijing, right? But now, today, if you actually look at the highway grid network in Hunan province, I can tell you there are 9 north to south highways, 7 east-west highways. So basically, this grid line would have every county in Hunan province totally covered, okay? And then there are also rail lines, crossing east-west and also north-south, all over Hunan. So with this kind of development, right? So it's no longer possible for assets of any value or anything of any value that is owned by the individuals or households to be free from the redeployment or exploitation by those who have power. So that's one quick reason. A second quick reason is that if we actually go back to the even the late 19th century China, there was really no nationwide financial network of any kind. There was no national bank, and there was no stock. Well, there was a stock market based in Shanghai back to the last 3 decades of the 19th century. But for the most part, no bank branch offices in my county, in Tali, Hunan. Okay, and because there was no nationwide financial network, all the financial resources in the local regions, in the counties, prefectures, and so on, would stay local. So today, of course, the headquarters for the Bank of China, ICBC, the China Construction Bank, you name it, they're all based in Beijing. So the deposits and financial resources collected at the local branches all over China or even in Hong Kong first have to be controlled by the headquarters in Beijing in terms of whom you can lend to, where you can deploy your financial resources. So all those decisions, right, are first handled by the headquarters, by the people in the headquarters in Beijing. So that also makes it now more necessary to have checks and balances on power, okay, whether it's political power and other power, administrative or even corporate power and so on, right? Then lastly, the annual budget controlled by the Chinese government at the central level as well as the local levels. So it's about 35% GDP. So you multiply this, so the total GDP now is about 85 trillion renminbi, so roughly 13 trillion US dollars, multiplied by 35%. So that's a big number. So close to 4.5 trillion US dollars. So when you talk about whether democracy is relevant, should be of any interest to the citizens in China, well, in dollar terms, right? About $4.5 trillion. How is that going to be spent? Who should get more out of the 4.5 trillion US dollars, and who should get less? Whether Shanghai and Beijing should get the biggest piece of that, and then folks in my county, in my province, Hunan, how much would they get? So it has become a very, very practical thing. I mean, you can see like this like among the angles I've been using in my Chinese writings to talk about why democracy is no longer just a political institution or political necessity, but an economic and financial necessity, because it really goes to the very pocket of every citizen, every taxpayer. Okay, I've said enough. So, so today, this is the very we're going to talk about this very, very timely topic, and the focus is going to be more on how China should or can democratize. Okay, so the speaker for today is our own Yoshikazu Kato. He is an adjunct associate professor at the Asia Global Institute here. And he has been writing on China, both on the political side as well as economic and other development dimensions within China, as well as between China on the one hand and Japan and the US on the other hand. Okay, so he's very knowledgeable about many dimensions, many aspects of China in the modern days. And he speaks perfect Mandarin. I think his Mandarin accent is much better than mine. So I'm being from Hunan, so that means 我有很强的湖南口音。Okay, so let's welcome. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, thank you, Professor Chen, for a kind introduction and your descriptions. How with China's political development going on? You are from your hometown, Hunan Province. Actually, Hunan Province has produced, a lot of influential politicians, over the history, like Mao Zedong or Liu Shaoqi. So, I'm very curious about how, did those leaders, face to democracy, or how, make China more democratic or something like that. And actually, I completely agree with Professor Chen mentioned. I personally, and even emotionally, I would say China should be democratized. I am not sure whether China can be democratized, but here today, I wouldn't say China should or should not be democratized. I think the more important work would be, how will, China be democratized or not. I think this is a very important work. And actually, since Xi Jinping, the current president, took office, I have been conducting my research on China's political development. And and I published this book, How Will China Democratize, in 2015 in Japan first, and recently published in South Korea, not North Korea, South Korea. And actually, to be honest, I tried to publish in China, including Hong Kong, but failed. I don't know what's going on, but maybe politically it's oversensitive or something like that. But anyway, be rejected. So I think this is even these kind of phenomena are part of how would Chinese political development going on. So I think for me as a Japanese, whether China democratize or not, I think this is a very important question, and even I would say this is one of the biggest question, even myth, for human beings in 21st century. So what motivates me to do research on this topic is because this is a very important topic, very important question, both for China, Japan, and the rest of the world. So this is my biggest motivation why I'm doing this research over the years. And this year, actually, Professor Chen just mentioned, but I want to quote The Economist, the world in 2019, and the editor, Daniel Franklin, quoted something on this year. And he wrote down about democracy on this year. He said, democracy has a big year this year. Countries with more than a third of the world population will hold nationwide elections, including India, the world's biggest democracy, as well as Indonesia and Nigeria. Optimists hope this will bring the beginnings of a reversal in the global trend of recent years towards declining freedoms. 5. He also mentioned about China. China gets nervous about the number 9. Years ending in 9 this year, ending number 9, bring a crunch of awkward anniversaries that worry China's leaders. In 2019, it is 100 years since the May 4th movement, just Professor Chen mentioned, a much celebrated protest, and 30 years since the bloody suppression of student-led demonstrations in Tiananmen Square. So, and then of course, this year is also 90 years anniversary of the founding of People's Republic of China. So 3 9s. So I think in Japanese words, this is the seasons of politics. The seasons of politics. So in my understanding, toward the season of politics, some characteristics or features, over the last couple of years. I think that basically 3 fundamental trend or features on the seasons of politics. I think the number 1 would be the tightening control. I think the Chinese Communist Party is trying to tighten the control in basically every area, including university, media, civil society, NGO, even economy, right? And the second one is the external relations. Their foreign policy would be more assertive, because a lot of political events in domestic can happen. So they're trying to somehow stimulate the nationalism, or how great the China is. And under these circumstances, China's foreign policy tends to be more assertive, not necessarily, but there is some kind of trend. The third one would be democratization on economic policy. Now, maybe because this book was written in 2015, so I expected or I estimated a couple of years ago, how China's, economic policy is going on, including back to 2013, the third plenum, emphasized on market, make market, playing the decisive role, in the resource allocation, something like that. But my some expectation or estimation was, was not right, or failed, or something like that. But I think I would say this year, yesterday we just looked at China's latest economic statistics, 6.6% growth. But I don't know what's really going on. Nobody knows, maybe. But I think the third trend would be the democratization on economic policy. So I think in this year, the economists emphasize the ending number 9. I think the 3 basic trends based on some historic records could be mentioned. The first of all, I want to say about that. And the biggest purpose in my presentation is providing framework for understanding Chinese politics. I wouldn't say China should or should not be democratized, but I think the most important work is providing framework for understanding Chinese political development. So I think the framework matters. Framework. Here, I wrote down, maybe you can't see. Sorry, because I can't use PowerPoint. So here, I provided the basic framework: domestic politics, structural reform, and external pressure. Domestic politics matters. Structural reform, not only economically, but politically. How would structural reform going on? And external pressure. I put down Hong Kong, Taiwan, Chinese overseas students, the United States, and Japan. Somehow external pressure to, push forward or undermine the China's political development. So how would, these 3 matters or, dimensions interact to each other? This would affect the basic direction of Chinese political development. And I think one more very important work is definition. So what is democracy? What is democracy? Very simply, I think, whether absolute or moderate, because actually I have talked with a lot of Chinese on democracy. What is democracy? Some Chinese say China is the most democratic country in the world. Yeah, a lot of people told me last time, including back to my student era in Beida. But I think here we should make very, very basic definition. 3 definitions. What is democracy? Everybody knows. Number 1 is free and fair election. Free and fair election. Number 2, the rule of law. The rule of law. Number 3 is freedom of speech and press. And maybe Hong Kong has 2, I think. Right. So if know these 3 inevitable, indispensable factors on democracy, I would say this country or society is not democratized. This is my definition based on the excellent works. But I can see some huge gaps. I mean, perception gap between China and the rest of the world. Well, of course, China is a very diversified country. So nobody says yes. Somebody says yes. Somebody says no. Somebody agree or disagree. So there is no that kind of united definition, maybe even in China. But I want to share with you some Chinese or Chinese reality indicates some election in rural areas, some small villages. Some people would argue China has our own election in some small village or rural area. Maybe, I don't know. I didn't examine very well, so I can't judge what's going on. But I think the election the Chinese official or China's some experts emphasize or define is basically fundamentally different with so-called democracy, including Japan, the Western countries, including Taiwan. It's fundamentally different, structurally different. But I don't know what's going on in the future. But this is the very important point. But last time I interviewed the relatively high official in the National Development and Reform Commission, who engaged in the drafting Xi Jinping's thought. I had a chance to interview him, and I introduced my definition to him, and his answer was very interesting. He said, "You already have bias, the Western-centric viewpoints. you do not respect the Chinese culture and characteristics. So I would say the Western countries and people are actually not democratic. China has more democratic mind and traditions. This is, his response. I respect him. That's okay. Different. What I want to say here is there is some gap. And second, the rule of law. The rule of law. Very interesting. Zhiwu Chen, the head of the Supreme People's Court, addressed at the speech toward judges on January 2017. He said, "We should resolutely resist erroneous influence from the West, including constitutional democracy, separation of powers, and independent judiciary. We must make clear our stand and dare to show the sword." This is Zhiwu Chen, the head of the People's Supreme Court, mentioned. Maybe not publicly, but there is some record. So we can see some gap. Actually, China's resistance to the Western democracy, this has been very clear. The third, freedom of speech and press. I searched the Chinese ambassador in the United States, Cui Tiankai's latest view on this. October 3rd last year, Ambassador Cui Tiankai had an interview with National Public Radio in the United States, the morning edition Steve Inskeep. And Inskeep asked Ambassador Cui, there is a lot of speech that would be off limits in China, more so than in the United States. Cui Tiankai answered, well, if you get on the Chinese social media, you could see what kind of freedom we have. All kinds of talks on social media. This is Ambassador Cui responded to the anchor. Of course, that's okay. Different view, different perceptions always. But what I want to emphasize here is there is some gap, perception gap, or definition gap between maybe mainstream of China or official in China and the rest of the world. So what is democracy? What is democracy? But in my research, I want to conduct my research based on this definition. Otherwise, nothing. Definition matters and framework matters. So this is what I want to emphasize first. And then, maybe you can't see this, but this is my framework: domestic politics, structural reform, and external pressure. And how would these three matters interact to each other and affect the future development of Chinese politics? And I want to very briefly introduce each pieces in each dimension. And maybe you can see this, but here the domestic politics. What's going on in domestic politics, including Xi Jinping's statements, Xi Jinping's thought on politics, or the characteristics of Xi Jinping's generation. Of course, including Chinese political system. These are very, very important for understanding. So I think first of all, in terms of understanding domestic politics, I think I put 5 chapters in. Actually this is my chapters of my book, and one is CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. I think understanding how will China democratize, I think the most important and basic approach would be understanding the Chinese Communist Party, its history, its system, its characteristics, its indifference, with the rest of the world. This is a very important work. For example, everybody knows, for example, 4 cardinal principles stated by Deng Xiaoping in 1979. The principle of upholding the socialist path, people's democratic dictatorship, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, and Mao Zedong thought, and Marxism and Leninism. These things are very, very important. So we can see, basically, how would Chinese Communist Party see the democracy, and how differentiate themselves. And actually, I've been working on Wang Huning, now the Standing Committee in the Politburo. Actually, Wang Huning used to be the international politics scholar at Fudan University in Shanghai, but now he's in the top 7, maybe, or top 7+1, because Wang Qishan is there. So and why Wang Huning is nominated, such a very important person. Some analysts argue, okay, Wang Huning used to be a scholar, he knows a lot about Western political theory. That's why this could be the driving force for promoting Chinese political reform under the Xi Jinping administration. I used to, see this kind of argument, but I do not think that. For example, because in my research, one who needs emphasis on the importance and authority of the central party. Actually, one who needs basic political thought and Xi Jinping's thought is highly compatible. Actually, one who needs supports China goes its own way, rather than change the political discourse or something like that. So I think we should have a different approach from the people, from the system, from the history. So anyway, focus on Chinese Communist Party. This is the first point. Second, legitimacy. Legitimacy matters. Where Chinese legitimacy coming from? Of course, in the democracy, including in Japan, in the United States, our legitimacy or accountabilities comes from procedure and process-oriented. I would say democratic election. If you are good, if you are bad, you should be resigned. When opposition parties attack you, when the free media criticize you, and then you will be resigned or something like that. This is always happening in Japan, right? So procedure and process-oriented accountability. But in China, I would say more like governance and outcome-oriented accountability. So you have to be well. You can't make a mistake. You can't make a mistake. Otherwise, maybe the history repeated. Otherwise, so I think it's a very different. But I owe to Francis Fukuyama, the author of The End of History, very influential, Japanese American political scientist now working at Stanford University. And Francis Fukuyama, in his book, 2011, The Origin of Political Order, he examined what is the modern political system, and he defined 3 elements should be included. One is a strong state, basically very, very, governable, has basic capability to govern these nation states, as strong states. The second, the rule of law. Third, accountability, democratic accountability. And if your political system includes these 3 elements, your political system could be said a modern political system. And Francis Fukuyama argued, since the unification back to Qin Shi Huang's era in China, looking back to Chinese history, China over the history has only depended on the first one, a strong state, ever neglected the rule of law and democratic accountability. That's why, given the Francis Fukuyama's definition, China's political system is not the modern political system. But legitimacy matters still, very important. That's why, I prepared 4 pillars for understanding legitimacy in China. Four pillars: political stability, economic growth, social justice, and human rights. In terms of ensuring that accountability, because if you can't assure the accountability, the nation would be collapsed, right? Legitimacy matters. That's why you need something to maintain your legitimacy. Otherwise people isn't convinced. People should be convinced by some ways, by institutions, by procedure, or by something. So maybe some propaganda or something like that. But I would say, political stability, economic growth, social justice, and human rights. These 4 elements or factors should be well managed by the governance of Chinese political system. And I stayed in Beijing during Hu Jintao's administration. So what I witnessed in Beijing was they made very obvious emphasis on stability first, all the time, right? And economic growth. Now maybe some skeptical in these days, economic growth. But back into before the financial crisis in 2008, maybe China maintained a relatively high economic growth. That's why accountability could be ensured, and social justice, more like welfare, medical system, education, the citizens and the fundamental rights or something like that. Social justice should be emphasized as well. And finally, human rights. I don't know. My instructors back to Beijing Dashi, in 1980s, they argued in maybe their students' era, they could enjoy freer or more some democratic or more relaxing surroundings to speak something or argue something. So maybe at that time, I don't know how Professor Chen talked about, but at that time maybe more more relaxing or comfortable surroundings on human rights was ensured. But what I witnessed in Hu Jintao's administration was stability always first, growth it's okay, but social justice relatively backward, and human rights was basically completely neglected. So how to prioritize, how to manage the legitimacy issue among 4 pillars, in the China's political system, different with Francis Fukuyama's, research. So this is the very important, angle to understand Chinese politics. How would the Chinese legitimacy of the political system be assured? And I think my argument is, in this book, now Xi Jinping's administration or Xi Jinping's era is entering post-stability and growth term. And human rights would be very much backward, compared to Hu Jintao's administration, even, worse than Hu Jintao's administration. I'm very sure, because at that time, like in Southern Weekly, Nanhan Chomo, I could write about political system. I can mention and a bit discuss. But now, I'm not allowed to mention, no discussion, no mention. So, actually, I could feel my personal experiences. I could feel, the human rights issue, including NGO or lawyers, human rights activists or NGO. Actually, the whole surroundings has been backward since Xi Jinping took office. So I would say social justice would matter. Under these circumstances, unless Xi Jinping, does very good work on social justice arena, otherwise China's legitimacy would be challenged. Because I would say the stability now is not unlike the 10 years ago. The growth now we are seeing something slow down. Human rights would be backward, obviously. So I think social justice should be higher position. This is maybe you can understand what I want to say here. So this is the legitimacy and matters. And then of course I also wrote about the China dream and the century of humiliation. I think I always say if China modernize its own country, they need to overcome the century of humiliation. China, of course, I'm a Japanese. Japanese should be very, very sincere on what's happened in history. But I think how the Chinese people, Chinese society overcome the century of humiliation, always victimize themselves. They are enemy, anti-imperialism. We have been victim, humiliate themselves. I think they need to overcome this kind of mindset in order to modernize the society. And Xi Jinping's thought here, in this book, I examined the Xi Jinping's 8 characteristics of Xi Jinping, his feature or his characteristics. Of course, based on my own research and the interviews of a couple of princelings like Qin or some friends of Xi Jinping, back to childhood. So I just very briefly I want to share with you if you are interested in my basic understanding of Xi Jinping's characteristics, because this is very important. Because now Xi Jinping basically the one-man politics. So how is Xi Jinping thinking about? How is Xi Jinping seeing the reality? The relation with the United States or Chinese future. This is very important, right? So very briefly, I want to share with you. One is listen to others carefully. Xi Jinping, my understanding, okay, it's not right. It's not necessarily right, but my understanding, Xi Jinping listen to others carefully. He doesn't easily stand up and speak out what I'm thinking about. First, listen to others carefully. First. Second, defeat rules and precedent, like term limits. Xi Jinping abolished the term limits of the president. Actually, and his views on his behaviors on anti-corruption campaign, or the stance on trade war with the United States. Xi Jinping tends to defeat rules and precedent. That's number 2. The third, Xi Jinping does not read the air. Read the air, very Japanese word. Read the air. You have to read air. You have to live in Japan. You have to read air. Oh, here, think about that. And think balance. You need to know how you behave. Otherwise, you can't survive in Japan. But Xi Jinping, in my understanding, he doesn't read the air. This is number 3. Fourth, Xi Jinping wants to control everything. He wants to control everything. Otherwise, he is not satisfied or convinced. Number 5, because of time, because I have a lot of cases, I have a lot of examples, but maybe the time limit, so just sharing with you. Number 5, Xi Jinping makes a decision by himself eventually. He likes to listen to others, but he makes a decision by himself eventually. Very, very, strongly. Number 6, Xi Jinping takes risks. He's a risk taker. Of course, a lot of people say he's a risk. He is a risk. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, he is a risk. I would say Xi Jinping is the biggest risk and biggest uncertainty in the current Chinese politics, I would say. But he takes risk, looking at he attacked his enemy, political enemy, or his some approach on dealing with the trade war with the United States. I think he is a risk taker. Whatever. 7th, lack of predictability. Lack of predictability. Xi Jinping's behavior are very difficult to predict. So very, very difficult to know what's going on next. So a lot of surprise. Xi Jinping has provided a lot of surprises, for the human being, I think. And number 8, lastly, consistency on the party and resistance to the West. Consistency on the Communist Party and resistance to the West, including Western value, Western political system. Of course, maybe he at the bottom of his heart, maybe he believes, but I do not think that. Still, China should be very sticky to the party, loyalty to the party. We shouldn't, accept, or we shouldn't be, undermined by Western, democracy or something like that. And this is number 5. Xi Jinping's political thought. Of course, his emphasis on mass line, or his consistency on the party. I was very surprised because the sentence, "the party leads everything," the party leads everything was written in the Constitution of China. But the question is, can party lead everything? Can the party lead everything? Everything. Economy, politics, military, university, media, foreign relations, NGO, China's image, soft power. Can the party lead everything? This is the question. I don't know. I'm still, watching what's happening. So this is domestic politics. I took some time, and now I want to move on to the structural reform. I need maybe pick up something. I think from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping, back to a couple of years ago, I would argue if Xi Jinping, survives this country, you need to go beyond Deng Xiaoping. If you only succeed the legacy of Deng Xiaoping, China's development couldn't be sustainable, economically and politically. Deng Xiaoping, a lot of his very influential remarks, like for example, let me share. Let some people get rich first. Do not debate. Do not debate. It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice. Cross the river by feeding mice for stones. Cross the river by feeding for stones. Something like that, So, actually, Deng Xiaoping, highly pragmatic, reformer. But, actually, he didn't provide answers. The China's roadmap of development, or consensus of national building, or value system to unite the people's, mentality or identity. So Deng Xiaoping, actually, he didn't provide, any very typical or sustainable, overview. But more like, now we need to communicate with the United States. We need to normalize the relation with the US. We need to open our country. So just go straight forward and move on. And then we need to, manage the problems flexibly. I think this is basically what my understanding to Deng Xiaoping's pragmatism. But if Xi Jinping, provides clearer answer or roadmap for China's sustainable development, I think Xi Jinping needs to do more. But this is not likely to happen. In my understanding, of course, Xi Jinping, previously, talked a lot about China dream, or China should be great, back to the future, the rejuvenation of the great Chinese or something like that. It sounds like roadmap, but actually it is a lack of more practical tactics or practical approach. And actually, Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping is the first leader who is not nominated by Deng Xiaoping since Jiang Zemin, right? Both Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao was nominated by Deng Xiaoping himself, but Xi Jinping is not. That's why at that time, I was arguing that maybe Xi Jinping can challenge something on Deng Xiaoping's legacy, but including politically. I wrote here Tiananmen massacre incident and political reform. I think these two are they're very, very highly connected. If the Chinese Communist Party cannot face and make sure what was exactly happened in the square, I think the Chinese political reform would be challenged. I think this should be going on simultaneously or with a certain balance. But I do not think this is going to be happened. Maybe I would argue later. But so this is the first point. Anti-corruption campaign. I think back to the first term of Xi Jinping administration, anti-corruption campaign was the biggest and most highlighted, political event. But of course, out of audience or citizens in China, they applaud. Oh, you are doing a good job. You removed a lot of corruption in China. Of course, I'm sure a lot of Chinese are not satisfied with the rampant corruption or corrupted officials. But I would say the existence and implement of anti-corruption campaign means Xi Jinping is not going to move on to resolve the political reform, this issue. Because if the rule of law works, if freedom of speech works, you don't need this, right? If the rule of law works, if the freedom of speech works, the party doesn't have to do this, right? This is the movement, not system. This is the political struggle somehow, not 100%. So I think the anti-corruption campaign means, I think at least at this moment, Xi Jinping is not going to promote the political reform. And actually, maybe Professor Chen, very interesting, but I think it has very negative impacts on economic reform as well. Now, I would say the fear politics. I could feel the officials in the central government, and some, including Hunan or a lot of provinces. Actually, they have been very scared. Maybe I will be attacked next. So whom should I catch up? They are surviving under the very fearful political surroundings, and this is undermining the officials' motivation and incentive to engage in the economic growth and reform. So we can see some negative impacts, from the anti-corruption campaign to the economic reform. So I think Xi Jinping is a risk taker. But I think this is one point. And looking at the Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang's reform, of course we can't talk parallel rhetorics on Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang. But I think looking back to the third plenum and the fourth plenum, for example, the third plenum, as I mentioned, the party emphasized the market should be playing the decisive role, in the process of resource allocations, right? And the fourth plenum, the emphasis on the rule of law, 依法治国, right? And we saw something positive, maybe previously, but now, what is playing the decisive role in the resource allocation? In my understanding, the answer is the party. The party is everywhere, because this was written in the Constitution, and this is exactly happening in my understanding. The party leads everything. including in the university, in media, I could feel, in my personal life work with China's counterparts or media journalists or even university professors. So I think now something different with what they try to do and what's exactly happening right now. So this is one part of this. And maybe finally here, nationalism. I think this is a very very complicated issue. That's why I just very briefly. I think because my basic argument is this: what's the relationship between nationalism and democracy and international politics? Now, looking at the Chinese public opinion or official statement toward the United States or the statements on the trade war with the United States, actually, the international politics stimulates the people's nationalism. Chinese people, public opinion is becoming more nationalistic, even assertive, even aggressive in front of the China's, surroundings in the international politics. And then, oh, you are democracy. You are always trying to contain or change the political discourse of China. Conspiracy. Okay, so that's why they are, stimulated. Maybe that's why China should pursue our own way. We are different with you. Nationalism. International politics undermines the democratic process of China. We could see these records. So in a trilateral relationship among nationalism, democracy, and international politics. And we can relatively clearly see actually the international politics undermines the process of democracy. So this is a very interesting point. And actually here, I mentioned overseas students. Overseas students. During my studying in the United States, I interviewed a lot of Chinese students, who studies in Harvard, MIT, Johns Hopkins, Yale, and of course, and I talked this topic with Francis Kuyama. Francis said, 20 years ago, Chinese students, studying in the United States, and they, admire or they respect, the Western democracy or freedom of speech or something like that. But today, somehow different. They are more confident. We have Gautier, very good Gautier. The U.S. doesn't have. We are more developed, or very, very, very oversimplified maybe comparison. But I think that now Chinese, students are, becoming more confident. But of course, confidence is good. Of course, you should be confident, right? Because China is rising up. Unlike Japan, Japan is in decline. China is rising up. In this context, I envy Chinese. I envy Chinese, because I grew up after the collapse of the Japanese bubble economy. But now China, right? China is rising up, expanding influence. It's good. But the problem is how to make use of confidence, right? I think now Chinese students is becoming more aggressive and more reluctant to accept, liberal democratic perception, value system, and becoming more Chinese characteristics. And Chinese Communist Party is taking advantage of this. So this is a relationship of conspiracy, in my understanding. So here, moving on to the external pressure. I included Hong Kong, Taiwan, overseas students, US and Japan. My basic argument is Hong Kong, of course, back to the 2014 and 15, we witnessed the umbrella revolutions, and actually the new bill for the general election in Hong Kong was failed or something like that. Anyway, I think some political development. Anyway, and actually, Chinese central government accepted. Actually, the Hong Kong's political development or democratic process, was, failed or backward somehow. And I would say, I'm not going to talk about the one nation, two systems, or what's the difference between, Hong Kong and Taiwan. Of course, very complicated situation. But my basic argument is the existence and development of Hong Kong and Taiwan should promote the China's democratization. This is the basic argument. Chinese students, Chinese tourists go to Taiwan and feel and see what is democracy. Same Chinese. Some Japanese argued, Chinese and democratization is incompatible. Chinese and democratization is incompatible. No. Looking at Taiwan, Taiwan realized the democracy. It's a real democracy. This democracy, right? Of course, some absolute or moderate or successful or unsuccessful or mature or immature, but the basic democracy. Taiwan realized the democratic process, right? So I would say if Chinese students, tourists, stay in Taiwan and could feel something democratic, and then back to China, mainland, and promote some more sophisticated, more inclusive political development based on your own experience in Hong Kong, Taiwan, United States. I don't know what's going on in Japan. So this is a basic approach on external pressure. But looking at the United States, I think, of course, China and the United States normalized the relation 40 years ago. This is the anniversary as well. But multidimensional communications between the two countries, students, tourists, business, statesmen, a lot of communications. But now under the Trump administration, I would say a lot of U.S. officials, scholars, even some pro-China scholars in the United States, now they are very, very reluctant to communicate with China. Looking at what's happening in the campus, media, civil society, like I mentioned. So a lot of strategists in the United States feels our engagement policy was failed. Previously, we expected these multidimensional communication could drive China to become more democratic, or at least more inclusive. Respect on freedom of speech, or civil society, or the freedom of academics, or something like that. But at least recently, maybe Xi Jinping is turning the clock back. Looks like, I don't know what's going on in reality. So I think U.S. engagement or the U.S. objective on China's democratization process, has been somehow challenged, at least not optimistic. Japan, very, very complicated historically because in the context or explanation by the Communist Party, the Communist Party defeated Japan, its aggression, and kicked out the Kuomintang and established the People's Republic of China. So the relation with Japan is somehow the origin of the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And actually, this is very, very closely related with the China's education, patriotic education, on the history. And of course, a lot of the Japanese say this is anti-Japan education or something like that. But now we don't have to talk about that. But I want to say is, Japan always could be a trigger. During my staying in Beijing, I witnessed a lot of anti-Japanese protests, demonstration, and actually I think back to 2010, of course in Beijing, I witnessed the anti-Japan protests, and then after the embassy, they moved to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and provide some protests. What I want to say here is, anti-Japanese could be anti-government, anti-party, looking back to the 100 years history in China and the relation with the China and the United States, China and the rest of the world. So I think Japan could be a trigger. I'm pretty sure I have to stop here. But finally, I want to say, so this is my basic framework. Domestic politics, structural reform, and external pressure. I think these three dimensions would interact to each other and undermine or strengthen the China's legitimacy or Chinese political development. And as I mentioned, I think here I do not see any driving force or positive phenomena in terms of whether China will democratize or not. I would say China is compared to previous days, China is more pursuing its own way. And own way. Of course, this is the China choice. Of course, this is not my problem, but this is influencing the discourse of human beings. That's why I'm paying attention too. But I think here, I would say China is definitely, particularly under the Xi Jinping administration, China is pursuing its own way. And this is a great challenge for us, how to communicate with China economically. Of course, some people are business side. So this is a very important question, and let's see what's going on next. Thank you very much. Sorry.
All right, so thank you, Yoshi. Let's sit down. Okay, I've been sitting all the time. So, all right. So, of course, in terms of whether China will be democratized, I'm very confident that it will happen. Of course, the biggest question is the timing question. If we actually pay attention to the fact that most of the democracies in the world today actually became democratic in the 20th century, in particular after the Second World War, then we should all be very confident that it will happen in China too. Japan mainly became democratic after the Second World War, and then Korea, South Korea, and then Taiwan, and then many other countries in Asia. They were not so before the Second World War. So that should give us a lot of confidence. And then now, maybe what we want to do next is I'm going to ask three major questions. So between Yoshi and me, we'll have some discussion around these three questions, and then I will open up to all of you for Q&A. So my first question is the how question, because if I have to pick different models that may tell us something about how China may become democratic, I can at least see that there are three different models or three possible different triggers in different ways. The first model is like Taiwan. Okay? So it's internally growing. So some of you may know Jiang Jingguo, being the son of Chiang Kai-shek. He basically voluntarily let Taiwan adopt checks and balances institutions, and then have election. Okay, and so that's the Taiwan model, which is kind of like how Russia became democratic in a way. If you all remember, Gorbachev was the one who really voluntarily offered to surrender power. So that's the Taiwan model or the Russia model. And then the second model is the South Korean model. All of us know that before the Asian financial crisis, South Korea was not really a totally democratic country. But as a result of the Asian financial crisis, it really forced the real implementation of democratic institutions, in particular free election in South Korea. And then the third model is more like the Japanese model. So the U.S. played a very heavy hand after towards the end of the Second World War to introduce a new constitution and then make democratic institutions in Japan take more of the real role in picking who is going to be the next administrative leader in Japan. So which of the three can tell us how China will democratize? So that's my first question. Okay, which model?
What do you think?
First, let you express your view, and then I'll give my take.
Yes, Professor Chen, very systematically, figured out the three different kind of models. Yeah, I agree with this framework. I think Japanese model is not going to happen.
So Trump and his successor will not play this big role
but
in really triggering this democratic process.
Yeah, but let it be clear. Japan. Japan. We back to 1945. Japan lost the war, and Japan was occupied by the United States, and then recovered the sovereignty as a nation state. And of course, I wasn't arrived there at that time, but a lot of my elderly senior friends told me at that time our politicians like Shigeru Yoshida, actually we appreciated, a lot of Japanese appreciated the U.S. occupation, while U.S. democratized Japan, U.S. demilitarized Japan, and removed the militarism of Japan thanks to the U.S. occupation. So at that time, a lot of Japanese appreciated the United States, even very, very appreciated. So I do not think this kind of logic is going to happen in China. I'm very skeptical, because different mentality and history, and I think ROK model, maybe some difference, before and after democratization, that the power of military in South Korea at that time. Now, PLA in China is totally under control by the Communist Party, right? So somehow different. And China, and how does China deal with the crisis? Because China Communist Party always sees the crisis as a chance, strategic opportunity. So Wei Zhongyouji or something like that. So maybe some different. Taiwan Russia model, maybe. Of course, I see some difference between Taiwan and Russia. I think, of course, in terms of the nation, I mean Taiwan, right? The origin by China. I think maybe Taiwan's model should be the case. I don't know how did Deng Xiaoping see the Jiang Jingguo. They studied together in Moscow, right? How did Deng Xiaoping see what's happening in Taiwan? And I would say Deng Xiaoping at that time, he tried to narrow the gap of political system over the strait, and then finally maybe China and Taiwan could be somehow united together. But political system matters. The political system should be converged from the time to time. That is my understanding on what Deng Xiaoping thought. And I would say maybe some chemistry between Jiang Jingguo and Deng Xiaoping. I don't know, but I would say maybe Taiwan's case, Taiwan experience should be the case. Not that without that kind of violence, without that kind of a revolution, but some internal driven atmosphere, and then the politician, relatively clever politician, made a strategic and historic compromise for the destiny of China. I think if this is going to happen, I think this is the best scenario. But but this is only my maybe ideal expectation. So conclusively, my answer is these are not going to happen.
You mean none of the three models?
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I somehow explained why. Yeah.
Okay.
What do you think?
Yeah, my take is, first of all, the Taiwan model is highly unlikely to be the way for China to democratize. I mean, in human history, it has been relatively rare for for someone to be in power and to surrender power and introduce checks and balances provided by a democratic system. Besides Jiang Jingguo in Taiwan and also Gorbachev, I can think of another case that's the English Glorious Revolution. But even that, of course, it was a peaceful revolution that led to the surrender of power from the royal, from the crown, English crown to the British Parliament. But other than these three, there have not been too many other cases. I don't think, of course, many people now still hope that the number one person in China today would actually follow that route to at some point do this. I know Professor Xu here, Xu Guoqi, he's shaking his head. He's agreeing with me that the Taiwan model is unlikely how such a process would be triggered in China. And then the other two models, right, the external pressure imposed democratization. I mean, of course, many of us, especially I know many of my friends on the mainland, may say, you know, look at what the Iraq experience has been. Okay, the U.S. imposed democracy several years ago in Iraq, and then look at what a mess it has created. But on the other hand, I don't know. It's probably more likely than the Taiwan model. If I would have to give a probabilistic assessment, just like if we just look at the trade negotiations that are going on the one hand, as Yoshi just mentioned, the party is racketing up the rhetoric against the West and other powers, especially by taking on Canada, to beat Canada up, involving this Huawei executive case. But at the same time, with such a credit or points won from beating up Canada and other countries, then the leadership can actually offer more concessions to the U.S. So I see, I read in the social media, some people commenting, why do we want to beat up Canada like this? Why don't we do it to the Canadian neighbor in the same way? Well, then the thing is, if China would beat up the U.S. in the same way as it has been beating up Canada, then indeed the international relations situation for China would be much, much worse anyway. So my point is, we probably cannot underestimate, the probability for this approach for the Japan democratization model to be how to trigger this such a process in China. The probability is not high, but I think it's probably higher than, as I said, than the Taiwan model. The highest likelihood, right, in my mind, is the South Korean model. Actually, over the last 10 years or so, I've been very interested in trying to learn more about the South Korean experience, because I do expect some kind of economic crisis to happen in China, because it's very hard to avoid such an economic crisis, because the whole system is just not set up to really self-correct the economic excesses and over investment that has to be paid by someone, right? So some economic challenge triggered political reform. It's much more likely than other triggers. So if that's the case, I think the South Korean experience may be the least painful way for China to finally adopt some checks and balances on power. But of course, at the same time, as Yoshi nicely and correctly highlighted, the experience and the examples set by mature democracies today, right? It's not that exciting, even to many of the elite policymakers and intellectuals in China, because they will easily point out, look at what the American democracy has done. Okay? put Trump in charge in the White House. Oh, that's thinking of that makes many people think that, or rather react right away. Oh, we don't want to go there. And then look at Brexit, right, in Britain, and then the political situations in Western European countries. So it's kind of unfortunate in that sense. All such examples that are supposed to be, enlightening and charging for the Chinese elite to actually push internally for more democratic reforms in China, because now they will say, just give me a good example that will make me excited to want to really work as hard as I can to actually let China also adopt some checks and balances like in the US. So I think this is, anyway, so I said I'm very positive, very optimistic about democracy to eventually occur in China. So that's why I give you the positive take first, right? And then now I sound pessimistic again. But let's all look at the big picture. So this leads me to the next question. That is, until this current leadership, many of my friends, including myself, were really hoping and also started to see signs that democracy within the party first, that became very obtainable, and many intellectuals on the mainland in the late 90s and early 2000s were pointing out the Japanese model. For many years in Japan, the ruling party, right, had different factions. So this cross-faction fighting and maneuvering led to more or less one party-based democratic system in Japan. Of course, today now there are more the Socialist Party and other parties that have a lot of seats in the Japanese parliament. But for several decades after the Second World War, the Japanese democracy worked pretty well. So many intellectuals on the mainland view that as a very workable model. So as a concrete implementational step, then let's start within the party. And then actually, before 2013, I was kind of getting excited because I thought, for the first time in Chinese history, there would be three leaders living, being alive at the same time. As if you have studied game theory, you know a two-person game is a three-person game is very fundamentally different from a three-person game. Because when you have just two people always thinking about how to fight and beat the other guy, it's much easier than to figure out what the best strategy is in fighting two other equal competitors. So I thought now the trilateral gaming among the three leaders together would actually lead to some consensus at some point for all of them to say, okay, let's just end all the fighting. Let's work out the basic rules of the game, right? But of course now we don't see that anymore because it's a more unilateral situation rather than a trilateral situation. So what do you think failed to make this potential multi-person game working out some democratic arrangement within the party so that eventually prepare the whole society for a final full-scale democratic system?
I think I have very clear viewpoint on this topic, and I've been always wondering, the comparison question, between the Chinese Communist Party and LDP, Liberal Democratic Parties in Japan, because since the end of World War II, since the ending of the occupation by the United States, our LDP has been basically dominant party. And so the first point, in terms of party politics or political development, even social governance, I think Japan's experiences could be said, somehow relevant for thinking about China's future development, compared to, the United States or other countries, in terms of mentality, some beliefs, Confucius or what stability means, how to understand the relationship between the sovereignty and human rights or something like that. I think Japanese is somehow relevant for understanding China's future development. This is number one, the first point. Second, I think LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, is somehow similar with the Chinese Communist Party, or some implication for thinking about the democracy within the party or inner party democracy. But one point should be very, very clear. Sophisticated opposition party, in terms of managing the party politics well, the sophisticated opposition party is more important than strong and dominant ruling party. Why LDP has worked? Because of the strong pressure from the opposition parties, including the Socialist Party. You need enemy. Former Japanese ambassador to China, Yuji Miyamoto, previously, he is a China specialist. He previously said, for example, there is a very good medical doctor, but even he cannot do surgery for his own illness. You can't do all the process of check and balance within the party. It's impossible. It's impossible. You need oppositions in the party politics, outside of the ruling party. So I think in terms of, I wouldn't say, what's China going on, but, given the Japanese experiences, I think how far could the party politics in China go beyond? I think the key player should be the opposition party. How to develop the opposition party rather than make the Communist Party's power and authority stronger. Third point, I think the outside of the party politics matters. Why Japan's LDP could be survived until today? Because of free press, because of the rule of law, because of the civil society. Of course, Japanese people are relatively, self-disciplined. They won't easily, stand up and go on the street. No, but so maybe somehow some similarity with China. But I think, in terms of the development of party politics, as I mentioned, number one, the opposition party in the party politics matters. Second, the opposition or some interest groups or civil society, the rule of law, free press, and these matters outside of the party politics matters. And in this situation, under these circumstances, I think Chinese Communist Party could go beyond. This is Japanese experiences. Of course, how could be adjust to the China's future development? I don't know, but just trying to share. Yeah.
Thank you. So this is actually, of course, this is my way of trying to let us understand what will actually eventually work out to be a way to trigger a democratization process in China. I mean, in retrospect, President Wu Jintao, without making such an announcement, I think he was quite influenced by this intra-party democratization approach, because now many people criticize him for having this 9-member standing committee, each of the 9 members having a real equal power. Each member had his own territory in terms of responsibilities, and then between any of the 2 standing committee members, no one would be easily allowed to interfere or intervene in the other members' territorial responsibilities and so on. But of course, that led to a pretty dysfunctional standing committee with all 9 members having their separate kingdoms. And that led to very indecisive decision making. And then, of course, that created this context for the current leader to concentrate all the power in himself rather than sharing the power with the other 6 members. So this is the second question. Let me move on to the last one. The last one is somewhat more academic, if you want, regarding legitimacy. You know, we're all very concerned about every country, any country, having a legitimate government or legitimate leader. But legitimacy is it's a very human-made concept, right? I like this author for this book, The Sapiens, Harari, this young, middle-aged Israeli scholar who wrote this famous book. So the book, the Chinese version has been so popular, 人类简史. But there's one point he made in the book that I really like. He said almost everything we take as rules, systems that we cannot violate, it's a man-made fiction. It's a fiction. It's not proven by hard evidence. So here, legitimacy, what do we mean by legitimacy being a fiction, whether it's based on elections or anything else? You know, in Chinese history, the first ever king or emperor who founded the Xia dynasty about 42,000 years ago. Well, he became the power holder everyone respected because he had this story that there was a big drought, in China for many years. Everybody was in a desperate situation. In order to ask God for help, like he actually cut his hair to pray for 3 days or 3 months, and then finally the rain came. Then every resident at that time in this tribe in around today's Henan was so grateful. Then this guy had the power. So that gave him legitimacy. And then after the Xia dynasty, some several hundred years later, several centuries later, this guy Shang gained legitimacy as the new king. To form his new kingdom, to change the name to Shang. Then the story goes, his father actually, he actually did not have a father. He had just had a mother. One day, this young woman was looking at the sky, and then somehow Shang was conceived by the young woman just looking at the bird, right? And that made this Shang guy so special. A God sent gift anyway to be, so he should of course have all the power, right? And then the Zhou dynasty was founded with a very different story. He created this theory about the mandate of heaven. So many of you have read stories written by Western journalists saying, the Chinese people always have this belief in the theory of the mandate of heaven. But this theory was created by the creator of the Zhou dynasty, Zhou. He said, the reason that I beat the guys of the Shang dynasty and won the war against them is because your former ruler was so bad. And then God was not pleased. And then he sent me to the humanly earth to take you guys over. So you all should be subjects of mine. And anyway. So of course today we say, well, legitimacy. How is it established? We say the majority vote should determine who gets to be the power holder. So that's how Trump came into power. This author, Harari, will say, well, democracy, who has proven with evidence that democracy is really the best legitimacy establishing institution. So Harari will say this is also a fiction, right? So we today are living through some of the bad consequences of this fiction. Okay, so what the reason took me too many minutes. The reason that I want to mention this is that many scholars in China are thinking in such similar ways. It's like, don't tell me election-based leadership selection is the only legitimacy granting approach.
Yeah.
Because this guy Yu, who founded the Xia dynasty, he had his theory too, right? And then Zhou Wang had his theory as well. So whose theory should be more acceptable? Well, then it depends on whether we have the best marketing manager to promote this theory.
Yeah.
What's your take?
So I at the beginning I introduced the Francis Fukuyama's model. I'm relatively convinced, but this is unlikely to adjust the China's model. That's why I here maybe most of the Chinese wants to have political stability, economic growth, social justice, and human rights, and how the party manage or prioritize these 4 pillars and maintain the legitimacy and let people feel I am convinced. So I think the people, 人民, I think that's why as a Japanese, I think how to understand the Chinese people, what the Chinese people wants, really wants. Do they want the Western context of democracy or freedom of speech? Of course, it depends on different people, but I think the people, addition to these 3 dimensions, I think the people, 人民, how to understand what people really want. Because in Chinese, 有什么样的人民就有什么样的政府. Every people, has the government it deserves, right? What people want and what the party provides, and there are some preconditional promise between the two. Chemistry, I could feel that. That's why I would say these 4 pillars matters. If Chinese government couldn't provide stability, growth, justice, and rights, I do not think Chinese people continues to be silent. The history would be repeated. A lot of records. What's happening over the Chinese history. That's why, maybe back to maybe the final question, I would say maybe Professor Chen doesn't think China, China is exceptional. The very famous theory, China's exceptionalism, whether China is different or not. My basic, of course, I can't come to conclusion, but at this moment, my conclusion is, China would be somehow exceptional. So I am less optimistic than Professor Chen on China's political development in the future. But but I think I'm always focusing on what people want in China, and some preconditional promise between the emperor and the people. They always communicate to each other, and they are always reading Remi Ribao, right? So people's daily. So I think this is my basic approach to understanding Chinese politics or relationship between the party and the people, and this is very important, angle to understand what's going on in China.
Thank you. To summarize, right? The question, what determines legitimacy, has gone through a long evolutionary history, right? For all human societies, it used to be really superstition or shama. That was the main thing to rely on. And then over the last century and a half, then democracy, or elections. determines legitimacy. Now, in the Chinese context today, it's neither of the above. So not many Chinese people would say, oh, XYZ is sent by God. I don't think many Chinese people will buy it. But Chinese people being so practical. So whoever gives us the highest GDP growth rate, we give him legitimacy to hold power. So economic outcome determines legitimacy. But of course, that theory has been relied on almost for too long, because now we are entering this reversal, this different process to see economic slowdown and so on. So maybe this is why I was saying the South Korean model may be more likely, because China cannot rely on economic growth to establish legitimacy anymore. So what else to grab or to rely on, right? So this is why something else has to be, some other story has to be introduced to replace growth as legitimacy, this paradigm that has governed China for the last 4 decades after Deng Xiaoping said, whether it's a white cat or black cat, as long as the cat can work, we'll let him be our leader, right? So that's workable when growth is always very high and so on. Okay, so I should stop here. So who would like to ask the first question?
What do you think is the likelihood of a violent means for China's democratization? Violence means, for example, revolution or external war, such as the Japanese model, for example.
Violence. Yeah, I think this narrative, as we discussed, Chinese government, can no longer provide public goods in China, and people, goes on the street and take advantage of violence to turn over the government or the party or the whole dominant system, and change to the different discourse. This has been happened over the history, and I think still relevant. And I think maybe I have to say maybe I'm sorry or something like that, but I think this is most likely. Whatever the motivational triggers, but maybe somehow combined. But I think domestic politics. I do not think, in my research, I do not think the external pressure plays a very decisive role on promoting the China's political development. So I think internal more internal surroundings or political struggle even. So that's why I would say that the anti-corruption campaign is dangerous. So Xi Jinping would be the biggest risk even. So I think once economy is slowing down and the hyperinflation or or some social mass incidents, and this kind of anxieties is prevailing in the nationwide, and then people feel now this is a chance, or some PLA's guys that take advantage of this unstable reality and turn over some conspiracy or some preconditional promise between maybe military and people. So a lot of uncertainties would be happening at that time. So I think what you mentioned, violence, this factor still very, very important.
I would say more likely unrest, social unrest with some violence, not so organized violence. It's a possible trigger. Actually, has to be there in order to trigger such a development process. The kind of mass-scale violence that the Communist Party relied on to found the People's Republic of China, that's more likely just to be history. It's not the future so much anymore, because one quick way to understand this is, the Communist Party, when they were doing things underground. Most of them, at least as we read from the books, they would go out at night to cause violence, cause trouble. During the day, they were sleeping, okay? Because the the government security people during the Republican period before 1949, right? They did not have night vision goggle technologies. Right? So at nighttime, then the underground Communist Party members would be able to come out. But today, does not matter with daylight or nighttime. Right? So that kind of underground organized violence as a way to topple a government and then establish a democratic new government, right? That's hard to work out. So I'm not optimistic in this prospect. I think some external pressure plus internal pressure through social unrest and so on are more likely. I mean, just quickly, historically, most of the big changes in China started with external pressure, not internal pressure. Of course, some of the more peaceful ones, like the British, after the Opium Wars, right, really stirred things up in a big way in China. And then the loss to Japan in 1895, in this naval war, that was another major trigger. And then anyway, I should stop here. So, the next question? Okay.
Thank you very much, Kato. Very good to have, independent or, objective and analytical outsider or non-Chinese foreigner, commenting on the Chinese politics. But just now you gentlemen mentioned about models, right? But I'm a little surprised that you did not mention the Singaporean model, because in my experience or opinion, China has always held a very high regard of the Singaporean political system. Not that it endorses the system entirely, but at least it's a compromise kind of system that it might more easily accept than the Japanese model, the Korean, which we tend to associate with the West, right? Colonialism and whatever. Okay, so the Singaporean model, of course, has also undergone changes, right? Lee Kuan Yew, the founder, used to be like Xi, right? You can say that, although they're different, and the parties are different. Communist Party is different from the People's Action Party, right? Communist Party is more pervasive and omnipotent and all that. But would there be a chance that, gradually, I don't know how long, because the Communist Party never lay out a plan. They like economic plans, but they never lay out a political plan, a 5-year plan, 50-year plan, never. Not that I know of. But is there a chance that they will eventually evolve over time into a Singaporean system? When, for example, Lee Hsien Loong is not Lee Kuan Yew, so that's why, he has to accept some opposition and all that, right? So Singapore nowadays is very different from the old days, right? And there's a good reason for that. No, sorry, I'm speaking about this hypothetically, but just want to get you experts' view on this. Thank you.
Yes, I think actually I discussed in this book, Singaporean model, or what can China study from Singaporean experiences. And I do know, Lee Kuan Yew, previously mentioned about, Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is like a Nelson Mandela, something like people, So, and I do think, China's officials, have been, studying or absorbing something from Singaporean experiences. So this means maybe China is studying, some, implication from Singaporean model. And I think, looking at the Singaporean political system and position of press and the court, I think that is, relatively, a kind of which China should develop and refer to. And if China is becoming more like Singaporean, that kind of model, of course, the different side, different population, right? So how to compare is a problem question. But I think if China could be, somehow, studying or, learn something from Singaporean model, I think this could be better, not worse. The one point. I think biggest implication from Singaporean model, in my view, I think Singaporeans' citizenship. Now, Singapore has absorbed a lot of good talents, from all over the world, right? this is somehow an opposite situation with China, right? Chinese government always emphasizes nationality, nationalism. We should be great, but the citizenship. I want to be the Chinese citizen, but now I am seeing a lot of Chinese citizens want to escape from China, right? Migrated to other countries, Singapore, Canada, United States, Australia. So I think, for China development, how to, in Wang Yi or some Chinese high official says, 中国护照的含金量, how something like that. But I think, as a nation building, Singapore has been very successful, like Switzerland. So I think how Chinese Communist Party could learn, from these experiences, enhance the quality of citizenship in China, rather than always stimulating China. It's great. China is accurate. The most democratic country or something like that. I think this could be very important process for more sustainable development in China.
I think as a scholar, I would say the Singapore model is too early to draw a conclusion on, because we have to wait a few more generations. I mean, Singapore has not really finished one cycle yet. From Lee Kuan Yew to his son, who knows after his son what will happen, right? So let's not, if I had a choice, I would not use Singapore as a role model to rely on yet. Let's just wait maybe 5 generations, and then we'll look back whether that really represents a different model. Where Singapore is, it's kind of like the pre-Asian financial crisis South Korea. So if you know what I mean. Okay, so I think we're already way after 2 p.m. Sorry that I guess I took too much time to say too much. But thank you for coming. This is a big topic. We'll continue to have debates, discussions, presentations on democracy in China. Okay, thank you again.